All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time. My name is Adam Van Wart. I am Associate Professor of Theology at Ave Maria University, and it's my privilege to introduce our speakers for this panel this afternoon. The format will be, as we have been seeing already, 20 minutes for each paper, 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then at the end we'll have ideally 15 minutes for a panel Q&A at the end. Joshua Lim is Assistant Professor in Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His research is in medieval Christology, focused especially on that of Thomas Aquinas. The title of his paper is Praeclarissimum, lumen, praedestinationis. That's too many syllables right after lunch, Joshua. Thomas Aquinas on the Predestination of Christ. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lim.
Can I close this laptop? You know? Can I? Okay. All right. So the title of my talk is Praeclarissimum, lumen, praedestinationis et gratiae, Thomas Aquinas on the Predestination of Christ. All right. In treating the doctrine of election, the great Swiss Reformed theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, takes special aim at Thomas Aquinas as a key figure in the Western theological tradition, who is remarkable for his failure to acknowledge the centrality of Jesus Christ in the knowledge of election. Quote, "The great exponents of the doctrine of election have not hesitated to point most emphatically to Jesus Christ when speaking of the knowledge of election. The only exception is Thomas Aquinas. He did quote Ephesians 1:4, but in his interpretation, he succeeded in not paying any attention to the in ipso, the in him," end quote. Aside from the fact that the Summa Theologiae is organized according to the Ordo Disciplinae, so that Thomas's treatment of Christ's predestination, quote, in a much later context, end quote, should not be taken by itself as indicating a relegation in its importance, a look at Thomas Aquinas' treatment of the predestination of Christ within the context of 13th century medieval scholasticism tells a very different story. In this paper, I will lay out Thomas's teaching on Christ's predestination against the backdrop of two parallel accounts in the 13th century, accounts with which Thomas would have been familiar, that of the Summa Hollensis and of Bonaventure's commentary on the sentences. While Thomas's contemporaries undoubtedly intend to give due weight to authoritative biblical and patristic texts, the concern to safeguard the eternal character of predestination leads them to attenuate severely the sense in which Christ's predestination can be considered as cause of our own. By contrast, Thomas's account, characterized by an insistence to foreground the role of Christ's predestination in God's eternal plan, leads to a new way of considering the eternal and temporal aspects of predestination, so that Thomas can affirm, in no uncertain terms, that the man Christ is, in Augustine's words, the clearest light of our predestination and grace. All right, so turning to the Summa Hollensis. For my purposes, I focus on only one of 6 chapters on Christ's predestination in the Summa Hollensis, namely chapter 5, which pertains directly to the question of its causality. The Summa Hollensis asks, quote, whether we are predestined through him, end quote. The biblical warrant for affirming the efficient and exemplar causality of Christ's predestination draws on 2 crucial biblical texts. Ephesians 1:5, he predestined us to the adoption of sonship through Jesus Christ, which suggests efficient causality, and Romans 8:29, those whom he foreknew he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, which highlights exemplar causality. The claim to exemplar causality will consistently be tied to Augustine's later on the predestination of the saints, which refers to Christ as the clearest light of our predestination and grace. The inquiry into what it means for Christ to be the cause of our predestination gives rise to an immediate difficulty. How can one predestination be the cause of another when all predestinations are eternal and therefore simultaneous in the divine mind? Inasmuch as causality implies a prior and a posterior, it seems impossible to posit causality and predestination without compromising its eternal character. The temporal and contingent nature of Christ's predestination seems to require a denial of any causal power on its part. Considering such difficulties and motivated to affirm in some way the causality of Christ's predestination, the Summa Hollensis draws a consequential distinction between two senses of the word. The principal signification of predestination is, quote, the divine foreknowledge with approbation, end quote, and as such, it is eternal. The secondary or connoted signification, however, is temporal and refers to predestination's effects of grace and glory. So I will refer to this distinction of predestination as the Hollensian distinction. So just in sum, the eternal and temporal aspects of Christ's predestination are distinguished according to predestination's principle, one, and connoted, two, significance. The result of this distinction is to preserve the divine eternity according to the principal sense, while relegating the temporal connoted effect to a secondary sense, which is extrinsic to predestination as such. By means of this distinction, the Summa Hollensis believes it can make sense of the affirmations of Scripture and of Augustine without violating concerns that arise from predestination's eternal character. The application of the Hollensian distinction provides a straightforward resolution to the objection posed against the efficient causality of Christ's predestination based on the absence of priority and posteriority in what is eternal. There is absolutely no causality with respect to the eternal divine mind, that is, according to the first and principal sense of predestination. Nevertheless, according to its connoted temporal sense, that is, on the part of the predestined, it is possible to affirm the efficient causality of Christ's predestination. This is to say that Christ, as predestined, in some way brings about the salvation of others who are predestined. While the distinction certainly resolves difficulties surrounding the eternity of predestination, it nevertheless leaves unclear to what reality the predestination of Christ as such refers. If we speak only of the connoted sense, and thus only of the temporal effects of grace and glory, we are no longer speaking of Christ's predestination according to its primary signification, but only of Christ as predestined. The problem is heightened in the Summa Hollensis' reply to an objection that denies that Christ as man is the light of our predestination. In its reply, the Summa Hollensis applies the Hollensian distinction to speak of Christ as light in two senses. According to the first sense, Christ is understood as light according to his eternal and divine nature. According to the second sense, Christ is a temporal light according to his human nature. The Summa Hollensis unequivocally affirms the exemplarity of Christ in the first sense, as God and as eternal wisdom. In this, the Summa Hollensis grants the premise of one of its objections, that the ratio or light of any predestination is identical with God. Since Christ is God, it is possible to say that Christ, according to his divinity, is the eternal light of our predestination. Significantly, however, Augustine's text speaks explicitly of Christ as man, as the light of our predestination. To affirm Christ as light only according to his divine nature thus appears to go against Augustine's own argument, which moves from the gratuitous character of the predestination of Christ's human nature to the gratuitous character of our own predestination. The Summa Hollensis attempts to save Augustine by recurring to the Hollensian distinction set out in the body, referring to what is connoted in predestination. The Summa Hollensis posits that Christ as man is, quote, the temporal light. Here the focus again shifts away from Christ's predestination as such to consider Christ as predestined, as the temporal effect of predestination. Inasmuch as the grace of adoption is a participation in the temporal grace of Christ, by which the Son of Man is the Son of God, Christ as man can be called a temporal exemplar and light of predestination. Here, the Summa Hollensis repeats the teaching of Alexander's disputed questions before he was a friar, where Alexander suggests that when St. Paul speaks in Ephesians 1:5 of our predestination to adoptive sonship per Jesum Christum, the per, which denotes efficient causality, should be understood not as referring to eternal predestination, but only to our adoption in time. Notwithstanding the Summa Hollensis' clear desire to affirm the causality of Christ's predestination, the explanation of its causal role via the Hollensian distinction leads to its minimization. Considered according to predestination's principal sense, the position of the Summa Hollensis is clear. The predestination of Christ the man is not the light of our predestination. Okay, and then turning to Bonaventure. So Bonaventure's development of the Summa Hollensis account in his commentary on Lombard sentences, Book 3, Distinction 10, applies the Hollensian distinction to the predestination of Christ and ends up further diminishing its significance. This is most evident in Bonaventure's reduction of the exemplar causality of Christ's predestination to its connoted temporal sense, which in turn leads to a moral interpretation of Augustine's text, exactly opposed to Augustine's original intention. Augustine's original purpose in pointing to the exemplarity of Christ's predestination on the predestination of the saints is to emphasize the gratuity and prevenience of God's grace. It is precisely because no merit or human act can be conceived as preceding the human nature's union to the Word, that Christ's predestination is the exemplar of our predestination. Yet for Bonaventure, the doctrine of the exemplarity of Christ's predestination becomes the occasion to consider what we must do in order to be conformed to Christ. Here, the Hollensian distinction not only limits Bonaventure's consideration of Christ's predestination as a temporal exemplar, but becomes the basis for a doctrine of moral exemplarity. In considering exemplarity, Bonaventure follows the Summa Hollensis in affirming that predestination is nothing other than the divine essence. As a result, there can be no relation of exemplarity between individual predestinations, quote, for all predestinations are one, end quote. The exemplarity of Christ's predestination as man is affirmed only with respect to the effect of his predestination, namely his grace and glory in time. Here, Bonaventure makes an explicit application of the Hollensian distinction, seeing Christ's exemplarity as belonging to predestination's secondary connoted sense. The result is an emphasis on Christ's moral exemplarity. Quote, for the grace of God is rightly in us when we are conformed to Christ. And if we ourselves wish to arrive at the final term of predestination, we must look to the author and perfecter of faith, who in how he acted gave an example for how we should act. For as Peter says, Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example, end quote. Bonaventure's focus on the connoted temporary sense of Christ's predestination leads to an interpretation of Augustine's text that is antithetical to its original intention. Quote, this is Bonaventure again, and thus Augustine says that Christ is the clearest light of our predestination, as if God says to each of us, look and act according to the exemplar which has been revealed to you in the mountain, that is, to Christ, end quote. Like Alexander and the Summa Hollensis before him, Bonaventure is aware that he must affirm the exemplarity of Christ's predestination as well as its efficient causality, but the Hollensian distinction, alongside his own severely curtailed view of the role of Christ's human nature, which I pulled out of the paper, prevents him from a robust account. On account of his use of the Hollensian distinction, Bonaventure is forced to reduce the question of the causality of Christ's predestination to its extrinsic temporal effect. As a result, Bonaventure's stated affirmation of the exemplarity of Christ's predestination turns into an affirmation of the exemplarity, not of Christ's predestination as such, but of his human acts in time. Christ's predestination thus becomes the occasion for moral exhortation. Okay, so turning to the Summa Theologiae. In broad strokes, Thomas's intention in the tertia pars is not different from that of his contemporaries. Thomas wishes to preserve the eternal character of predestination while finding some way to account for the causality of Christ's predestination. Like his contemporaries, Thomas resolves the concern not to violate the principle that the eternal has no cause through a distinction between predestination's eternal and temporal aspects. Yet, instead of following the Hollensian distinction between predestination's primary and secondary sense, Thomas distinguishes the eternal act of predestination from its temporal term. For the sake of simplicity, I will refer to Thomas's distinction as the Thomasian distinction, and summarize it goes, the eternal and temporal acts of Christ's predestination are distinguished according to 1, the act, and 2, the term of predestination. The result of this distinction is to preserve the divine eternity without relegating the temporal aspect to something secondary and extrinsic to predestination as such. Here, the temporal effect as terminus ad quem specifies the eternal act. Turning to Thomas's treatment of Christ's predestination, we see how the Thomasian distinction enables a more robust account of its causality. Thomas identifies two aspects of Christ's predestination: the act of the one who predestines and the term and effect of predestination. According to the act, Christ's predestination cannot be the exemplar of our own, quote, "For in one mode and in the same eternal act, God predestined us and Christ," end quote. Here, Thomas joins the rest of his contemporaries in denying the causality of Christ's predestination with respect to its properly eternal aspect. For Thomas, however, the temporal aspect does not refer to a connoted and secondary sense of predestination, but to the term of the act, that to which one is predestined. Though absent in Thomas's scriptum, Augustine's on the predestination of the saints figures largely in Thomas's reconsideration in the Summa of Christ's predestination. In the Sed Contra, Thomas quotes a fuller version of the text, which makes clear that exemplarity is predicated of Christ precisely as man. Quote, "He is the clearest light of predestination and grace, our Savior, the mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ," end quote. Further, Thomas clarifies that Christ's exemplarity is here considered not simply in terms of the temporal effect of grace, but in terms of his predestination as such. Quote, "But he is called the light of predestination and grace, inasmuch as through his predestination and grace, our predestination is made clear. This pertains to the ratio of an exemplar," end quote. Both in his emphasis on Christ's human nature and on the exemplarity of Christ's predestination as such, Thomas simultaneously moves away from the Summa Hollensis, which emphasized Christ's divine nature as exemplar, and from Bonaventure, who posited a moral reading of exemplarity, returning to Augustine's original intention. Considered as term, Christ's predestination is exemplary in two ways. First, since predestination is ordered to a good, in fact, to the highest good, which is the final end, the predestination of Christ to natural sonship serves as an exemplar for our own predestination to adoptive sonship. Here, Thomas relies on the work he has done in the previous question, question 23, on filial adoption, to show that the predestined are ordered to a participation in the natural sonship of Christ as their final end. The teleological orientation of predestination, explicit in the early definition of the prima pars, is now reintroduced under the aspect of the concrete end of the predestined to be adopted children of God. Quote, "For he is predestined to this, that he be the natural son of God, but we are predestined to the sonship of adoption, which is a kind of participated likeness of the natural sonship," end quote. Here Thomas relies on Romans 8:29, "Whom he foreknew, these also he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." Notable by its absence is any distinction between Christ's temporal and eternal exemplarity. Through the Thomasian distinction, Thomas overcomes the difficulty faced by the Summa Hollensis. It is precisely as man that he is considered the light of our predestination. Thomas does not stop here, however. Christ's predestination is not only exemplary with respect to the good to which it is ordered, but also with respect to, quote, "the way of obtaining that good, which is through grace," end quote. In direct contrast to Bonaventure's teaching on exemplarity as primarily moral, whereby the predestination of Christ is meant to show us how we ought to conduct our lives, Thomas recovers Augustine's original intention, focusing emphatically on the divine prerogative, quote, "which indeed is most manifest in Christ, because the human nature in him, by no preceding merits on its part, was united to the Son of God," end quote. The predestination of Christ is not a moral exemplar, but an exemplar with respect to the absolute gratuity of divine grace. For the Summa Hollensis, and in a mitigated way for Bonaventure, the affirmation of the causality of Christ, whether efficient in the Summa Hollensis or dispositive in Bonaventure, practically amounted to a consideration of the effect of Christ's predestination in time, that is, the role of Christ's temporal life with respect to our own. In these thinkers, the consideration of the temporal aspect required the bracketing of the eternal. Far from considering the causality of the predestination of Christ, they considered the causality of Christ as predestined. By contrast, the focus in the tertia pars remains fixed on Christ's predestination as such, that is, the role of Christ's life from the vantage point of God's eternal preordination. In this vein, Thomas focuses on the fact that the very means and order of our salvation fall under divine predestination. Thomas signals the unity of act and term by constantly highlighting their relation. Quote, "For in this way God foreordained our salvation by predestining from eternity that it should be completed through Jesus Christ, end quote. And speaking of the completion of our predestination through Jesus Christ, Thomas offers an interpretation of Ephesians 1:5, just quoted in the Sed Contra, quote, who predestined us to the adoption of sonship through Jesus Christ, quote. Markedly distinct from Alexander, who took Paul's per Jesum Christum to refer to temporal adoption rather than to predestination. Thomas explicitly reads the through, as referring to our predestination, and speaking of the temporal term of predestination, Thomas is not forced to move away from the eternal act of predestination to consider something extrinsic to it. We are adopted through Jesus Christ only because we are predestined through him. The developments in Thomas's teaching on Christ's predestination, seen most closely against the backdrop of the broader discussion in 13th century scholasticism, offer a correction to Barth's harsh appraisal. Through the Thomasian distinction, Thomas is able to affirm not only that the predestined Christ in time brings about our salvation, but that from eternity, Jesus Christ is at the heart of God's plan of salvation. Thank you.
We have about 7 minutes for questions. And if you would, please use the microphone. We can probably all hear each other just fine, but for the people on Zoom, they'll want to be able to hear the questions.
Am I allowed to? Joshua, I'm wondering, do you think there's any connection? I mean, well, first, does the Summa Lensis take a position on the question of the possibility of the eternity of the world? And two, do you think there might be any connection between, say, the difference between Bonaventure and Thomas on the eternity of the world's creation and this question of the eternal predestination of Christ? That, I guess what I'm kind of thinking is, Thomas seems to have a way to think causality without temporal priority, right? And I'm wondering if there might be some relation between those.
So I don't know what the Summa Lensis says about that. Yeah. And then, as far as the eternity of the world, I haven't thought about that. That's a good question. I will have to think about that. So I've been trying to think of areas outside of this consideration where Aquinas might come up with this sort of distinction. I think it's kind of latent in the Prima Pars account, but it seems like it's brought out explicitly when he deals with the predestination of Christ. But I would have to think about it in relation to the eternity of the world. Yeah, thanks.
Other questions?
Hey, Josh, that was great. That was a great paper. And so the question I had was really just a simple one. It's like, why wouldn't Karl Barth be satisfied with that? Why was I just wondered if you could, since you didn't choose to use that as sort of a hook, I just wonder. It all just seems quite reasonable, and I never had anything. So I just wondered if there was something else in Barth, and that you might. Just going back to that hook after you presented the what seemed to be very, very reasonable, and surely if Barth surely he would agree with that at least. I wonder what you would think if you had a thought on that.
Yeah, so it seems like Barth would not be satisfied with it precisely because he wants to say that the one who is the subject of predestination, or the one who is electing, is Jesus Christ, and so there. I think, with respect to what Bonaventure, the Summa Lensis, and what Thomas Aquinas hold, by distinguishing the eternal aspect and denying causality there, that would preclude Barth's position, because it seems like Barth wants to say that somehow God's decision to be for us in Christ precedes election, or I'm not entirely sure if he would say precedes election, but in some ways constitutive of the decision to elect. I don't know how exactly to make sense of it metaphysically, but so I think all three thinkers treated would preclude Barth's position simply because they don't allow for causality with respect to what is eternal as such. So, and Barth would likewise have a problem with them on that. Yeah, not radical enough.
Thank you for your paper. I was wondering, if I remember correctly, Bonaventure, when he talks about the to what extent Christ's humanity can cause grace, he thinks about it more in terms of moral causality, yeah. Whereas later Thomas will think about it in terms of instrumental efficient causality. Now, obviously, Thomas doesn't think that Christ is an instrumental efficient cause in terms of predestination, if I understand correctly. But do you think that there's any connection between this and Thomas's developments on Christ's
There is, yeah,
instrumentality?
and he does. So what initially got me interested in the paper was I thought that Thomas disagreed with others in affirming efficient causality, because he does, with respect to Christ's predestination. And then the way he hashed it out, I thought maybe they were all saying the same thing. But one area of difference is for Bonaventure, Christ's human nature. So not even considering the question of the eternal aspect, but purely from the perspective of Christ's human nature, it can only be a dispositive or an excitative cause, but it does not efficiently cause grace. So that is actually a secondary area where in the fuller version of this, I treat the question of efficient causality. And there too, you have now two reasons why Aquinas sort of represents a deepening in how we understand the causality of Christ with respect to his predestination as such, but also with respect just to his human nature. He is the efficient cause. I just referenced Matt Messer has his dissertation works on this question, but yeah.
Maybe one brief question.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for the paper. Actually a real question of ignorance. Why on Romans 8:29 you said it was exemplary, reference to exemplary causality?
Yeah.
So the question is why is exemplary causality a problematic cause according to the problem you lay out? Like why is God
Eternally?
Yeah, eternally.
Yeah. So because it would, so it's the question of who is it an exemplar for, right? And it seems like if you say it's for God, then you're introducing priority and posteriority in eternity, and likewise if you say for us. But so I think in either respect it would be problematic. But the move that Bonaventure makes is to say that so nothing temporal can be an exemplar for God. And so anytime we talk about exemplarity with respect to what is temporal, it has to be for us. And then the way Bonaventure goes with that is, therefore, it has to be moral exemplarity. But I think his reason as to why it can't be eternal is sound, because it's something. It's not as if God regards something temporal as an exemplar for what he's going to do in time. That doesn't really seem to make sense. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lim.
Thank you.
Our second speaker, Frederick Bauerschmidt, is professor of theology at Loyola University, Maryland, and a deacon of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. He is the author of several books, including most recently a collection of essays on St. Thomas entitled Thinking Through Aquinas, appearing this week from Word on Fire Academic. The paper he has for us this afternoon is titled The Question of Infused Habits, Christ's Knowledge and Our Virtue. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bauerschmidt.
Thank you, Adam. So, two wrongs, I think, almost certainly don't make a right. But my gamble is that two sources of puzzlement brought together might actually shed some illumination. And the puzzlement is over this notion of infused habits, which occur in two places in Thomas. It occurs in the Secunda Pars, talking about the infused moral virtues, and it occurs in the Tertia Pars in connection with the knowledge of Christ, that Christ has infused habits of knowledge. And I think most people who work in either of these areas will agree that both of these notions of infused habits are kind of puzzling. They bring with them all sorts of issues and controversies. So the first part of the paper, I try and lay out what some of those issues are, but let me just do a real short summary, and I'm just going to trust on y'all's vast Thomistic reservoir of knowledge so that you will, I hope I'm not going to leave anybody behind. So with regard to the infused habits, this is a question that has revived as a point of controversy, really, I think, in the last decade, and I actually think I witnessed its revival at a conference in Utrecht about a decade ago that had Bill Madison, Angela Knoebel, David DeCosimo, Tom Osborne, and they were going at it hammer and claw, and I didn't even know that this was something you could be interested in. So anyway, and so a lot's happened in the last decade, but so the basic claim of Thomas is that along with faith, hope, and love, the infused theological virtues, there are also infused moral virtues that correspond by name with the acquired moral virtues. And it seems to me that there's three options for interpreting these infused moral virtues in the case of a Christian in the state of grace, and particularly the relationship of these infused virtues to acquired virtues that a person might have had before entering into a state of grace. And so what I would call the traditional view is that a Christian in a state of grace can simultaneously possess both acquired moral virtue and infused moral virtue, and that there's a kind of a division of labor, right? The acquired virtues help you with your natural end, the infused virtues help you with your supernatural end. There's what I would call the revisionist version, which used to be a distinct minority, but I think is rapidly becoming a majority, which is that for the Christian in the state of grace, there's only infused virtue. Acquired virtues are either replaced or transformed with the infusion of supernatural charity. And then third, there's what I would call the re-revisionist or the neo-traditional approach, which posits simultaneous possession of infused and acquired moral virtues, but an ordering of the acquired virtues by the infused virtues. Okay, so you have both, but they're not segregated, as in the more traditional view. To put it simply, the real interpretive question is, when you read the Secunda Pars, particularly the Secunda Secundae, are you reading about infused virtues or acquired virtues? Thomas never says. And some things he says seem like they could only be true of infused virtues. Some things he says would have to be true also of acquired virtues. And the real question is, why does Thomas never tell us? Right? Okay, so that's the question about infused moral virtue. The puzzle over Christ's infused knowledge is Aquinas' position laid out in the Tertia Pars, that in addition to his knowledge as the Word, as the divine Word, Christ's human soul possesses three sorts of knowledge. Right? I think we're pretty familiar with this. Beatific knowledge, which seems to be the most controversial claim among modern theologians. Our sad little modern Christologies that want to have Jesus as miserable and as ignorant as the rest of us, right? Christ also has acquired knowledge, and Thomas is somewhat swimming against the medieval tide in the robustness of what he wants to, of his account of Christ's acquired knowledge. And then third, infused knowledge, which most, I think, modern theologians don't even pay enough attention to disagree with Thomas on this. But this is generally compared with the kind of knowledge that angels have, which raises a couple of puzzles, this infused knowledge. One is the puzzle about baby Jesus knowing, and I'm using Father Gaine's examples from an article, baby Jesus knowing from the moment of conception Chinese grammar, the details of quantum physics, or how to fly a jumbo jet. So that's one puzzle with this infused knowledge. The second is the idea that the passive intellect can possess identical forms of the same thing from two different sources. Right? That just seems strange. So I think the parallels between these puzzles, I hope, are maybe obvious, but let me spell them out real briefly. As regards the overall scheme, in both cases, we're dealing with the infusion of a set of habits. In both cases, these infused habits fall midway in a threefold scheme, right? The infused moral virtues are, in a sense, midway between the infused theological virtues and the acquired moral virtues. The infused knowledge of Christ is midway between his beatific knowledge and his knowledge acquired from sense experience. In both cases, the upper member of the triad, the theological virtues and the beatific vision, is something inchoate or intuitive and, as it were, non-specific, not oriented toward discrete pieces of knowledge or specific actions. In both cases, there is no obvious problem relating the infused habit of the higher member to the lower members. The puzzle is in thinking about how the infused habit relates to the acquired habit. They are, to use the way Jean Porter put it, with regard to the infused virtues, she says the infused virtues represent the comprehensive perfection of the faculties they inform. They are, again, not compatible with the acquired virtues, which represent another kind of comprehensive perfection of the same faculty. So what she says about infused moral virtue, you could say about the infused knowledge of Christ. At least in terms of what Thomas claims to be the case, what seems clear in one domain seems unclear in the other. So, for example, in the case of Christ's knowledge, it is clearly the case that Thomas maintains that Christ possesses infused and acquired habits simultaneously within the same faculty. How you make sense of that is a different question, but Thomas clearly says Christ simultaneously has both forms of knowledge. So should this tilt the debate over infused and acquired virtue toward the position that the same person can possess both kinds of virtue? But though Thomas clearly holds to the coexistence of these two sorts of knowledge in Christ, it still raises a host of difficult questions, right? So maybe it doesn't help us. Maybe it actually should tilt us away from the notion that we can have infused and acquired moral virtues simultaneously. So, there's one more source of puzzlement or maybe source of disappointment in our modern expectations and desires, that in both cases, Thomas argues for the infused virtues on the basis of ontological perfection, leaving aside what we might call existential or psychological questions. Christ has to have infused virtue because he has to have the most perfect form of human knowledge, right? He must have all his faculties, including his passive intellect, perfected, right? Christians need to have infused moral virtues to be perfected in the things of this world so that they can attain beatitude, right? So it's argued for moral perfection. Thomas never seems to ask what it might, as we would say, feel like to have infused habits, whether of virtue or knowledge, nor how you might narrate this in terms of a life story, whether of the Christian or of Christ. So, given all these puzzles, which spring both from what Thomas says and from what he does not say, right? There's all sorts of questions he just doesn't answer that seem like obvious questions to us. Can we undo this tangle by comparing what he has to say in these two domains? So Thomas is relatively clear that infused and acquired moral virtue are distinct habits because, quote, they differ not only in relation to the ultimate end, but also in relation to their proper objects. The acquired virtues have to do with life in the earthly city, and infused virtues have to do with our heavenly citizenship. But clearly, while wayfarers, we remain in some sense residents of the earthly city, even while through grace we are citizens of the heavenly. Such simultaneous possession of infused and acquired virtue then would seem not only to accord with our actual experience of having mundane concerns even while we're yearning for beatitude, it also tracks with Thomas's position that Christ possesses acquired and infused habits of knowledge. And if the Christian in a state of grace does simultaneously possess both acquired and infused moral virtues, it seems to me that the integrity of the human person suggests that these different sorts of habit must in some way be integrated. In other words, to lay my cards on the table, I find most convincing the account of relationship of acquired and infused moral virtue to be the one I described as the sort of neo-traditionalist or re-revisionist approach, which is that the acquired and infused moral virtues can both be in a Christian in a state of grace, with the acquired virtues being ordered to the final end via the infused moral virtues. Okay, so I'm going to go with the people who want to say the Christian in a state of grace has both kinds of virtue, with the infused virtues ordering the acquired virtues to beatitude. So, for example, the acquired prudence of the abbot that the abbot exercises with regard to negotiating fair prices with vendors can be ordered to the final end of beatitude by being subordinated to the infused prudence by which he cares for the souls of his monks, which in turn actually enhances his care of earthly matters. If acquired moral virtues are ordered to their final end by the infused moral virtues, does it make sense then to suggest that the acquired and infused knowledge of Christ is similarly integrated? Can a higher mode of knowledge order a lower mode? On the one hand, this would seem to somewhat restrict the contents of Christ's infused knowledge. And this is one of the things Thomas says. It says that Christ has, his infused knowledge is comprehensive. Everything that can be known by a human being is known by Christ via infused knowledge from the moment of his conception. My proposal that the higher knowledge is ordering the lower knowledge might seem to somewhat restrict that content. While he might have infused knowledge of carpentry, it would seem to have to be precisely that knowledge of carpentry that is relevant to his mission of advancing humanity in goodness and removing it from evil. And it is difficult to see how knowing how to miter two boards together could have such relevance. On the other hand, if we were willing to restrict Christ's infused knowledge, it would certainly relieve us of the burden of imagining infant Jesus knowing Chinese grammar, the details of quantum physics, or how to fly a jumbo jet, while still allowing that Christ has infused specific knowledge relevant to his saving mission that exceeds natural human knowledge derived from experience. For example, Thomas says Christ had infused knowledge of the marital situation of the Samaritan woman at the well in order, quote, to bring her to a spiritual understanding so that she might believe that there was something divine about Christ. But maybe there's a sense in which we can retain the fullness of Christ's infused knowledge while seeing it as distinct from his acquired knowledge by being ordered to his saving mission to bring humanity to its ultimate end. If I'm right in thinking that the ordering of acquired virtue to the final end is mediated by infused moral virtue, then perhaps we might think that it's through the mediation of Christ's infused knowledge that his acquired knowledge is ordered to his mission of bringing human beings to beatitude, the beatitude that he himself possesses by the light of divine glory. What it means to say that Christ possesses the fullness of infused knowledge is that he possesses by special divine gift the capacity to use anything that a human being can know for the honor and glory of God. Perhaps the knowledge of carpentry is not simply knowledge of carpentry that is acquired, that is the acquired knowledge of carpentry, and that there is a knowledge of carpentry by which Christ knows that his sharing in human life and labor is part of his salvific mission. The infused knowledge of Christ then would serve to mediate between his beatific knowledge and his acquired knowledge by referring that acquired knowledge to the end that is beheld in the light of glory. Let me let me move on, and and just in the interest of time, let me just conclude with some reflection. So, does this actually solve the problem? I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I'll be honest. And I've been thinking about this since that conference in Utrecht 10 years ago, and I still don't know. There's so much that, what's so puzzling about both of these areas is that the questions that it raises seem so obvious to us, and yet Thomas doesn't seem to address the questions which seem to us so obvious, right? And if anything, I always tell my students, Thomas is not only good at giving answers, he's great at asking questions, right? He thinks up new questions to ask all the time. So how do we think about the things that Thomas doesn't ask about, the distinctions that he doesn't draw, the things that he leaves unclarified? The tendency to treat Thomas as having an answer for everything is a persisting sin among lovers of St. Thomas, engendered not simply because of the church's tendency to treat him, at least since Aeterni Patris, as a kind of oracle, but also because he, in fact, answers so many questions so well. Because he's so clear about so many important things, one temptation in the face of Thomas's silence, especially around our modern questions about the experience of persons, is to decide that there's something wrong with those questions, that these are not questions worth asking. But that is surely mistaken. I can't imagine anything less in the spirit of St. Thomas than a moratorium on asking new questions. Another temptation is to think that because Thomas doesn't address these questions, that he has nothing to teach us even by his silence. Thomas's silences might be, and certainly in some cases are, the result of his failure to imagine a question we might have, perhaps as a result of the limits of his historical horizon. But in some cases, like he doesn't ask about the morality of nuclear weapons, right? But in some cases, these silences might be more deliberate, a certain kind of reticence that recognizes the limits of our inquiry. Thomas's dry and precise scholastic idiom can tempt us to treat his various distinctions as a kind of total inventory of items out of which human thinking about God and all other things in relation to God can be constructed. But Joseph Pieper is, I think, only slightly overstating his case when he says, quote, its fragmentary character belongs to the total implication of the Summa Theologiae. Perhaps a summary of theology, by its very nature, must be incomplete, and not only in the sense of the whole being unfinished, which is perhaps an accident of history, but also in the sense of various lines of inquiry being broken off before we feel our questions have been answered. Distinctions that might have been made being left unmade, conclusions that might have been drawn being left undrawn. When Thomas does not pursue a question, does not make a distinction, does not draw a conclusion, this may be a simple failure on his part, even Homer nods, but it might also be a significant silence, a silence that is telling us something important about the object of theological inquiry and about the inquiring subject. We must keep in mind what Thomas himself knew, that all of these distinctions between various sorts of habits and our best attempts to explain their relation are simply heuristic devices that represent our best attempts to account for, on the one hand, the moral and spiritual development of human beings, and on the other hand, the claims made about Christ in Scripture and tradition. Whatever distinctions we introduce to account for the rich complexity of human action or the knowledge of Christ should be made while bearing in mind that what we are attempting to grasp are living wholes. And such wholes always suffer somewhat from the autopsies that we theologians perform on them. Though he was the master of the distinction, I do not believe that Thomas ever forgot this, and that we would forget it at our peril. Thank you. I left out a lot, so I'm hoping I can put it back in and answering your questions. So if I don't seem to be answering your questions, it's because there's something else I wanted to say.
Oh, that sounds perfectly reasonable. I'm Adam Idle. I teach at the University of Dallas. I I wanted to just say one thing about the analogy you're constructing. And this I'll admit is a shameless plug for my own paper for those of you who will be here tomorrow. But one of the issues with the debate over the acquired and infused virtues has to do with just the completely ahistorical vacuum in which it's been carried out. Once you read Thomas in his context, you see that in fact, the generation prior to him, and William of Auxerre in particular, held that the acquired and infused virtues cannot be compatible. Albert and Bonaventure come along and say, no, they exist together. And then there are objectors who come and say, but you can't have two forms of the same species in the same subject. And that's what prompts Thomas to say, they differ in species then. So that's a really, just to see that progression is really important, because the whole reason he's arguing for the distinction in species is to put that minor premise in there that allows him to say they exist together. But so I it's difficult to hitch the problem to a problem that's so problematic. But if we put all that in place, I think that you're actually on the right track. But I wanted to ask about the ordering of the two different kinds of knowledge. Thomas, in the Tertia Pars, he comes to that view you're describing after having rejected it in the scriptum. It's right. He actually comes to say later, no, they have to be together. How does he think of things being ordered? Well, this has to do with wisdom. So in the same way that the acquired virtues are ordered by charity,
Right.
Would it not be just the case that Christ's wisdom orders both kinds of knowledge?
I suppose it could be, but and of course this is much more in your realm than in mine, but I mean, it seems to me that even if charity is ordering both the infused and acquired moral virtues, I think it's in De Virtutibus 110 where he talks about how the infused moral virtues also have a role in ordering the acquired virtues, right?
There is that passage where he speaks.
Yeah, and I know it's a controversial passage, and is it an abandoned position or whatever. But that suggests to me that even if wisdom, or as say beatific knowledge, is ordering the acquired virtues, it maybe you can think of it as ordering it by means of, the acquired knowledge. Maybe it's doing it by means of the infused knowledge. I guess that's kind of what trying to draw the parallel there. So I tried in the longer version of the paper come up with some examples of like how this could help us read the stories in the Gospels. I know Drew's going to disagree with me because we had a conversation earlier.
Well, thanks for your thought-provoking paper. You made a case for the continued utility of the acquired moral virtues in the life of a Christian. You
Right.
gave that example of the abbot who, maybe negotiating bread prices or whatever it was for his monastery could use his prudence and justice.
In my imagination, it was wine prices.
Wine prices,
but,
sorry.
yeah.
Okay. Even better. Okay.
It's a French monastery.
Well, they probably make their own wine, but they're selling it in any case. But I guess the question I have is, in the case of a Christian who has the infused moral virtues but lacks the acquired virtues, is such a person just going to be unable to really negotiate their earthly life very well, or will the infused virtues allow them to take care of their day-to-day business in light of their pursuit of heaven in a way that would be sufficient, or are they really going to be lacking something to make them function well as a human being on the wine negotiation prices?
Well, I mean, I think the Holy Fool is something more than just a literary convention from Russian literature. I mean, I feel like I know a few, people who don't seem to actually, I mean, not like gross immorality, but they just don't navigate life in a manner characterized by worldly excellence, yet they're, in my mind, undeniably holy. And so maybe that would be what it would look like for somebody to have the infused virtues, but not to have ever developed the acquired virtues. I mean, maybe given that the infused virtues are going to keep you ordered to beatitude, presumably that would keep you out of mortal sin, right? But it might not make you very wise in terms of the ways of the world, in ways that might actually be of use to yourself and other Christians. It might make it might be a more difficult path. So that would be the example I would think of.
Okay, thanks. I was just thinking lots of Christians might not have the acquired moral virtues. I mean,
I think-
they might not be holy fools on the other hand, right?
Well, that's true. That's true. Well, I mean,
So what about a person?
holy by habit, if not by act. Yeah, I mean, it might be the case that a lot of people behave in foolish ways, while still being in a state of grace. So.
But they're going to be foolish without the acquired virtue.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. There's places in Thomas where he seems to imply that the infused virtues can sometimes, compensate or I'm not sure.
Thank you. I'd love for you to go back to the Gospels. And in particular, I'm thinking about the times when there's a question of whether Jesus knew the answer to a question he was asking. And the typical patristic response, which Aquinas draws on a lot, is, well, he knew, but he did that for our sake. And I'm wondering if, speak about the Gospels in whatever way you want, but in particular, if there's any way that we could make sense of that interpretation in light of the thing you're proposing.
Well, I mean, a kind of a classic example of Jesus not knowing something is Mark 13, right? No one knows the hour, but only the Father, not the Son. And I'd like to think that my proposal could work. That in some ways he has a infused knowledge of this. That's a kind of one thing I left out was the distinction in terms of the infused virtues between having the habit and being able to exercise the act. And I was saying this might help us think about the infused knowledge of Christ. He could have it, in a sense, habitually, but not be able to activate it. And in the case of the Son in his humanity not knowing the hour, maybe that's actually important for the work of salvation, right? I think he could also give you, of course, Thomas would not like this, but it could even give you a way to go back and rethink, what Paul means by fides Christi, right? Thomas, of course, says Christ doesn't have faith, but perhaps if there is a kind of a habitual infused knowledge. But the other case I thought of was the case of the Canaanite woman, right? And that's one of the things that modern people don't like, the standard patristic exegesis, which is, Thomas cites Origen, Jerome, Augustine, who all say, he knew about her faith. She's not teaching him anything. But it could be that there's a kind of out of that encounter that Christ gains a certain kind of acquired knowledge that in some ways activates his habitual knowledge about his mission, that he has habitual knowledge that he's come not just for Jew, but for Gentile. But it could be that habitual knowledge needs to, in a sense, be exercised in order to become kind of active knowledge, and that the acquisition of the knowledge in that empirical encounter with the Canaanite woman might be an occasion. So I don't think Thomas would particularly like that interpretation, but I think it could be. I can kind of draw some principles from him to kind of make that more supported. So in a sense, you would say, well, yeah, in terms of his infused knowledge, he knew that his mission was to both Jew and Gentile, right? But that something actually does happen in that encounter, right? That there is a kind of an acquired knowledge. Thomas wouldn't like me saying she taught him anything, because Christ doesn't learn anything from another human being. He just learns it from watching, right? But anyway, that would be another example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Father Simon Francis Gaine is a member of the English Dominicans. Before joining the order, he studied theology at Oxford, subsequently teaching there for many years and serving as regent of Blackfriars Hall. He currently teaches at the Angelicum in Rome and is both director of the Angelicum Thomistic Institute and its Pencare's Professor of Theological Anthropology. He's a member of the International Theological Commission and the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the author of Will There Be Free Will in Heaven? And Did the Savior See the Father? The title of his paper this afternoon is Aquinas on Christ's Co-Assumption of Power. Please join me in welcoming Father Gaine.
When the third part of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae has concluded its treatment of the human nature assumed in the Incarnation, the author moves on to what he says is co-assumed in the union, before treating what he calls the union's consequences. He speaks of three perfections co-assumed in the union, namely Christ's grace, his knowledge, and his power. Both Christ's grace and knowledge have been much discussed in recent work on Aquinas. But it seems to me that little has been said about Christ's co-assumption of power in his human soul. Even treatments of Christ's miracles can neglect his co-assumption of the power to work them. The medieval discussion of Christ's human power was focused on the question of whether Christ's human soul was omnipotent. Given that he knew pretty much everything in his human soul, did he also have the power to do everything? Early modern scholasticism debated exactly how to categorize the power found in Christ's human soul. And I say something about this in the fuller published version of the paper. My focus, however, is more on the significance of why Aquinas speaks of the power to work miracles as co-assumed rather than as a consequence of the union. Aquinas had previously treated the question of Christ's power under a broader category of consequences of the union. What Aquinas does in the Summa is to insert between his treatment of the human nature assumed in itself and the consequences of the union, he inserts a section on what is co-assumed in the union. This is a category of dividing material that he took from the Summa Theologica of Alexander of Hales and his Franciscan disciples. In addition to what is assumed in human nature per se, Alexander treated penalties that Christ took on for our salvation. These he took not as pertaining necessarily to human nature, but as defects freely co-assumed in addition to human nature. Aquinas expanded the division of co-assumed by including within it not only defects like bodily passibility, but also perfections, namely grace, knowledge, and power. What he'd previously treated under consequences of the union, he now shifted to what was freely co-assumed. Not that Aquinas' treatment of perfections co-assumed only spoke of what was co-assumed, strictly speaking. He also touched on some things inevitably assumed in the human nature, and also on what was freely not co-assumed, and indeed what was not co-assumable. For example, when treating of Christ's knowledge, he makes it clear that Christ did not co-assume full comprehension of the divine nature, because the infinite act of knowledge that would entail is simply not possible for a finite intellect. At the same time, this helped Aquinas distinguish one thing Christ did co-assume: the blessed vision of the divine essence, and in it, vision of everything God creates. He distinguishes that from unco-assumable comprehension of the divine essence and knowledge of the infinity of worlds God can possibly create. Something similar happens when Aquinas considers Christ's co-assumption of power. Christ does not have omnipotence, strictly speaking, the active power to do anything that can be done in his human soul. This is not because the divine word could have co-assumed such omnipotence, but chose not to. Rather, since the distinction of Christ's natures is maintained in the union, and the power to do anything that can be done belongs incommunicably to the infinite divine nature, Christ's human nature in itself does not possess strict omnipotence, but the active power belonging to human nature. So Christ's human nature is not involved in creation out of nothing, which Aquinas takes to pertain only to the infinite power of the divine nature. Moreover, it is the same with anything on the same level as creation out of nothing. Aquinas thus concludes that Christ's human soul did not have the power of annihilation, that is, of reducing creatures to the nothing from which they came. The power of annihilation, like that of the preservation of creatures, belongs to divine power alone. What is freely co-assumed is then to be distinguished not only from what is strictly unco-assumable, but also from what is inevitably assumed in the human nature. This figures very briefly in Aquinas' consideration of Christ's knowledge, which is mainly concerned with Christ's co-assumption of blessed, infused, and acquired knowledge. He also mentions that Christ, having a human intellect, had knowledge of first principles. For Aquinas, such knowledge comes inevitably by way of having a human mind, and was not something further and freely co-assumed. What is inevitably assumed with human nature plays a greater role when Aquinas comes to Christ's power. He needs to distinguish much more clearly what is strictly co-assumed from what is assumed. So, in the union itself, Christ assumes the natural powers of the human soul to rule the body and to be the source of the normal human acts that pertain to human nature. Hence, among other things, Christ's soul had the same power with regard to the body that every human soul does with regard to its own body, and such things come by nature and not as some perfection co-assumed. Perhaps surprisingly, Aquinas does not go on to say that any power relating to the supernatural is what is co-assumed. Instead, while the distinction between natural and supernatural plays a role here, it is not the crucial distinction, and we'll see why. Before he goes on to speak of the co-assumption of the power to work miracles, Aquinas also speaks of Christ's ability to act in a way that is not miraculous, but nevertheless supernatural. He is concerned here with acts that follow from Christ's co-assumption not of power, but of his fullness of grace and knowledge. This supernatural grace and knowledge enable Christ to do such things as supernaturally enlighten rational creatures. Now, this is not to be considered a miracle, because the supernatural enlightenment of angels and human beings does not mean a departure from the regular order and course of things. But more to the point, grace and knowledge enable Christ humanly to enlighten others as the principal efficient cause of their illumination. Just as the assumption of human nature enables Christ to act as a proper human agent, the principal efficient cause in his humanity of his own acts, so the co-assumption of grace and knowledge allows him to be the principal cause in his humanity of certain supernatural acts, like enlightening others. But with the working of miracles, Aquinas does not consider Christ to have been acting humanly as a principal efficient cause. Rather, there can be no principal cause of what departs from the whole order and course of the created order except God. Aquinas has already set out his position in the first part of the Summa, that miracles are attributed in this way only to divine power, where God causes something not effected by created causes, such that the effect's cause is entirely unobservable by us. What creatures can do by their own natural power remains within the order and course of things as a whole, and God alone by divine power can be the principal cause of effects that depart from that order. So Aquinas identifies the power in Christ's soul to work miracles not as one where he acts humanly as a principal efficient cause, but one where he works humanly as an instrumental cause. It's the distinction between principal and instrumental efficient cause that enables Aquinas to home in on Christ's specific co-assumption of power. He has prepared the way for this by first considering Christ's power arising from his human nature, adding the power arising from his co-assumption of grace and knowledge, before finally coming to the power co-assumed precisely where his human soul operates instrumentally to cause miracles. Now, we've already seen that such things as creation out of nothing and annihilation are simply unco-assumable, and there Christ's human instrumentality could have nothing to contribute. My question at this point is whether Christ assumed the power to perform every miracle that is co-assumable, in cases where his instrumentality would have something to contribute. In other words, for every possible miracle we can name, did Christ co-assume the power to work that miracle? Should it have been the case that the power to work every possible miracle was an inevitable consequence of the union, and any incarnate divine person would have the power to work every possible miracle by some kind of metaphysical necessity, we would have to say the same of Christ. He necessarily had the power to work every possible miracle. But what if the power to work miracles is, as Aquinas treats it in the Summa, something freely co-assumed? Does he co-assume the power to work every possible miracle? It seems to me that in the course of discussing the question of Christ's omnipotence in regard to his own body, Aquinas intimates a possible miracle that Christ did not co-assume the power to perform. He puts the following objection to Christ not having omnipotence over his own body. Through the state of original justice, Adam's body was entirely subject to the soul, such that nothing could happen to the body against the will of the soul. Now, given that Christ was more perfect than Adam, the objection goes, his soul should have had omnipotence over his body. In his reply, Aquinas is clear that, while Adam did not have anything like omnipotence over his body, he did have the power to preserve it from injury. Aquinas responds, Christ could also have taken on this power if he had wanted to. Perhaps the simplest way to interpret this is to suppose that Aquinas was merely excluding from Christ the version of impassibility proper to original justice, because he had already said that by Christ's instrumentality, every disposition of his own body was totally subject to his power. However, we may also consider a more speculative interpretation of Aquinas' position, which would exclude any version of impassibility from Christ's earthly life, including one that's miraculous. Given that Christ co-assumed passibility, could he also have co-assumed the power to prevent his passible body from being injured when attacked? On this reading, Aquinas would reply that Christ could have assumed this power if he had wanted to. Here we may have something Christ could have freely co-assumed, but which he did not. It is not then that Christ had the power to preserve his body from injury when attacked, but did not use it. Rather, he didn't have the power at all. Aquinas gives no reason why this power would not have been co-assumed, but it's easy to see why he might have thought that it was not. It was the purpose of the incarnation that Christ redeem us by his passion. The power to prevent injury miraculously would in no way contribute to that goal. Moreover, were Christ to have exercised such power at any point prior to the Passion, it would easily have led to the impression that he was not really human. This is perhaps confirmed by what Aquinas explicitly said about the co-assumption of power to change material creatures. If we speak of Christ's soul insofar as it is the instrument of the Word united to him, it had an instrumental power to effect all the miraculous changes ordainable to the end of the incarnation, which is to re-establish all things that are in heaven and on earth. By citing Ephesians 1:10, Aquinas was alluding to the miraculous transformation of all things at the end of time, which he clearly thinks will be effected instrumentally through the instrument of Christ's humanity. Likewise, the miracles of Christ's earthly life are ordained in the service of our faith in the incarnation. On Aquinas' view, then, Christ co-assumed the power to perform not just those miracles that were, as a matter of fact, ordained to the incarnation, but whatever miracles were ordainable to the end of the incarnation, even if he did not in fact do them. I think that in general, Aquinas was inclined to think that an incarnate divine person would co-assume perfection rather than defect, as a sort of default position. However, the perfection or the defect was ultimately co-assumed to serve our salvation. In this way, those miracles, and only those miracles which could not serve Christ's saving mission, were wisely excluded from co-assumption. I end the full version of this paper by asking whether this approach can help us with other speculative matters, including why Adam and other Old Testament figures and the Christian martyrs would seem to enjoy gifts that the earthly Christ did not possess. I also explore whether this approach can explain why, in Mark's Gospel, Christ not only did not work miracles where there was a lack of faith, but could not work miracles in his home country. Finally, I suggest that an appreciation of Christ's power to work miracles as something co-assumed can reinforce our appreciation that Christ's grace and knowledge are not necessary consequences of any hypostatic union, but were freely co-assumed by Christ. Thank you very much.
We've got about 9 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Father Gaine. So you outlined well the change in reasoning that Thomas employs to in considering power, what sort of power Christ assumed. That previously he considered it as a kind of consequence of the union. Then he considered it as insofar as it pertained to some kind of salvific purpose, right? I'm wondering whether you find reasons for Thomas no longer thinking it should be a consequence of the union. In other words, not just kind of a recognition that the reasoning has changed, but why he might disagree with the reasoning he previously employed.
Okay. I think originally it's not so clear. I think consequences of the union, it's a very broad category. Albert the Great used it too in his sentence commentary in trying to make sense order what's in Peter Lombard's sentences. So I don't think it was that there was a great thinking about it beforehand, and it's not entirely clear to me to what extent Aquinas thought this was something that followed necessarily from the incarnation, or whether it was only some other kind of consequence. But I suppose what he'd been thinking about in the meantime, and I think it was seeing this kind of division at work among the Franciscans, he came to think that if you think very clearly about what an incarnation must involve, and God could have caused all sorts of incarnations in all sorts of different circumstances, if you think about what has to be excluded by it because it involves a contradiction and what doesn't, he could see that an incarnation need not involve all the things that the actual incarnation involved, and that some things did not follow, but it's not that God chose to have an incarnation and lots of things just had to follow. It was really because it was much more focused on God's saving purpose. And I think at the same time, in thinking about ordering the Summa, the saving purpose of the incarnation was coming very much to the fore of his thinking. So I think all those things kind of fitted together. I have the feeling that, if he thought about it some more, he might not have done it quite as he did it. You say there are questions that don't get asked, like there's no question, as far as I can see, talking about instrumentality as such. Whether would that be placed under co-assumption, or would it be a consequence of the union? I mean, I think it would be a consequence of the union, but that doesn't mean that everything about instrumentality that Christ had would automatically follow. But it had to follow that he was an instrument. I think that's what he thought. He doesn't give us a question on it. There are these things that he doesn't say, and nor does he explain his thinking on this. So to some extent, I've been trying to reconstruct. I like doing this, thinking about what was going on in St. Thomas's head that he did this. And so thank you very much for the question.
Thank you for the talk. So I just had a question about instrumentality, actually. Yeah, could you say more? So I thought you said that with respect to his grace, or with respect to grace, he was a principal efficient cause, but not an instrumental efficient cause?
In terms of certain acts arising from the fact that he had the co-assumption of grace. I mean, in terms of him being the cause of grace in us, he would be an instrumental cause. But there would be other ways, I think Aquinas thinks, in which Christ, having been graced, can be the principal cause of certain acts, like enlightening us about matters of revelation and so on. But that doesn't mean that everything in regard to grace is going to be principal efficient cause.
Thank you for your talk. One thing that you said really struck me was that Christ was limited in his ability to do a miracle by a human's lack of faith or not developed faith. And one thing that I hadn't understood, I guess, before this conference was that Aquinas said that Jesus did not have faith, or it wasn't, he didn't exercise, or maybe, I don't know how to say it, but he didn't have faith.
Yeah.
And so how could he have been limited in his ability to do something by the lack of somebody else's faith?
Okay. So Aquinas thinks that he really wasn't limited. Certainly, if you look, say, in his commentary on Matthew's Gospel, there's no sense in which he thinks that he was limited. And certainly, he has the divine power to do this. When he talks about, I mentioned the Gospel of Mark, he does mention this in the Summa Theologiae, when discussing whether miracles were by divine power, and he affirms divine power there. So I think that Aquinas thinks he just didn't do it. There was a good reason not to do it, and so he didn't do it. Although, of course, there are some exceptions in both Matthew and Mark, and that was because in those cases he didn't want the people to have the excuse that, well, we would have believed if you'd worked some miracles. So he does work a couple, and then the people have no excuse. And this is something, he takes it from Theophylact. He's got patristic sources for all these things. So I think it was my suggestion, it's only a speculation, that maybe you could use the notions that Aquinas has about co-assumption of power. You could use that to say, well, maybe because it was not fitting for his mission that he work miracles where people were ill-disposed to have faith, maybe he did not co-assume the power to work them. And you can use that as another way to explain the inability that we see in Mark's Gospel. But it's not something that Aquinas actually says. I don't think he doesn't say that at all, but I was suggesting we might be able to get some kind of speculative exegesis that somehow gives another way to interpret Mark's. He could not work miracles there. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Father Gaine. At this point, we can open the questions up to anyone in the panel, so direct your question wherever you like.
Hi, this is for Father Gaine. And I was, things were, you were, I think I didn't catch exactly what you said in the part of the paper. Now, I'm thinking of where Aquinas is insisting upon Christ's freedom, to on the cross, his freedom to die or to choose to die, and he talks about something that's always, at least when I first read it, it quite alarmed me. I thought he talked about his power to repel the nails, or to not be wounded, not essentially not be crucified. So and then I thought you were saying that that Aquinas does not think. I think I missed something, but I thought you were saying something that Aquinas holds that Christ did his human soul did not have that power, Whereas I, for some reason, I had this memory of thinking that that the human soul in some way did have that power, but I know that I've missed something, and I've forgotten. It's something in Aquinas that I should have known.
Okay, it's first of all, on those texts, it would be good to check whether he's speaking about divine power or about human power. But I think probably the simplest way to interpret Aquinas in the co-assumption of power question would be to say that he did have that power in his human soul, because he does say in Article 3 of question 13, in the body of the article, he does say that by his instrumentality, the whole disposition, every disposition of Christ's body was subject to his power. So that would lead me to think that Aquinas did think he had the power in his human soul. It's just that in the reply to one of the objections, when he talks about Adam having the power to prevent injury to his body when attacked, he does say that Christ could have taken on that power if he'd wanted to. Now, there does seem to be a tension there, okay, between what you've got in the response and maybe the text you're quoting and what he says in the reply to the objection. I think there is a simple way to resolve it as a historical interpretation of Aquinas, to say he's only excluding Adam's version of impassibility, but not excluding every version of impassibility. So I was giving another way maybe to come at it, a more speculative rather than purely historical interpretation, where maybe Christ did not assume the power to prevent that injury at all in his human soul, on account of the fact that it could not be ordained to the end of the incarnation, which was for him to suffer and die on our behalf. That's an alternative speculative reading, which Aquinas does not say, or maybe at least does not clearly say, but I would like to give it a run for its money. Because I think a lot of what Aquinas has in this question is very undeveloped. A lot of it you feel he's in a bit of a hurry. He makes things less clear, I think, than he usually does. And I think sometimes this gives us the opportunity to actually play with different alternatives for how this might be developed. One thing that makes me think, well, maybe we could think a bit more about this, is he doesn't really give a reason why he thinks Christ's instrumentality would give him complete power over the dispositions of his body. I suspect it's because he thinks that this would pertain to Christ's perfection. Now, there's an awful lot of talk about perfection. There's an awful lot of talk about ordering things to the plan of salvation. And I think, well, as I think Joshua shows in his article in the International Journal of Systematic Theology, that it's not really you've got two principles at work, and maybe it's one. They are actually ordered to one another, and the principle of perfection is actually ordered to the soteriological principle. Have I got you right? Okay. Well, that makes me think, has Aquinas in this rather hurried question thought through all the ways in which the principle of perfection is subordinated or ordered to the soteriological principle? So I was thinking maybe actually, Christ might not have co-assumed this kind of complete power over every aspect of his humanity, because it might not have served the end, they might not all have served the end of the incarnation very well. So, this is all a speculation rather than me giving historical exegesis of what Aquinas actually said or thought.
Yeah, let's make one comment. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I like your the way that you're moving here. I really like this a lot. because I remember when I was a student, when I first read this, it just freaked me out, the idea that that the nails could sort of bounce off human flesh. It does seem implausible to me, and it does seem strange. It seemed Gnostic. But when let me ask you for one follow-up though. One thing that really does strike me though is that let's just say that before Christ goes up to Jerusalem, or on the Wednesday before the Holy Thursday, if Christ had just gotten a terrible cold and couldn't get out of bed or whatever, that kind of thing. So how does one, if one, do you understand the question I'm raising? In other words, the type of thing that, whereas I'm extremely comfortable with Christ
having a cold.
Well, I'm extremely comfortable with Christ not co-assuming the power to prevent the nails. And you were thinking along those lines, but somehow it does seem important that is there some way of maybe you would just appeal to divine providence, or you wouldn't want Christ to be so susceptible that if someone had given him the flu on that week, that he wouldn't have the salvation of the world would somehow have been delayed or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can always say God's providence can always sort that, make sure it doesn't happen. But Aquinas would have thought that Christ had the instrumental power to kind of heal his own flu, just like that.
But,
He would have
that would be
thought
the
that.
same principle, right? The same principle as the one that would to
Well,
repelling
it
the
depends.
nails.
He might have thought that, it would actually contribute to the end of the incarnation if Christ could heal himself of the flu, so he precisely could go and do what he's got to do on the Thursday and the Friday.
Okay, but let me just make sure that I'm clear. So you're saying that that we can take away the co-assumed power for repelling the nails
For what can't be ordained to the end of the incarnation.
Right, I see. I think I understand.
But I wouldn't exclude what could be ordained to the end of the incarnation.
Okay.
And maybe, being able to heal his flu miraculously that he catches on Wednesday could be ordainable to the end of the incarnation.
So I want to push this a little bit more. What if we don't use the flu example? What if he's going to get hit by a camel and he's going to die of accidental causes right before he's supposed to go to his passion? Okay. The question is, it seems to me that in that case, being able to either have an impassible body or make his body impassible would order his life towards the purpose of the incarnation by saving himself, by allowing him to survive the encounter with the camel the week before his passion. And so what's the point? The point is that it seems like it's not the case that having that power couldn't be ordered towards the purpose of the incarnation, if that's true. Does that make sense?
So you mean it could be ordered in the case of being hit by the camel, which could be a mortal injury?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe that would be something where, so he could prevent himself from injury, perhaps, except that, the ultimate point of all this is for him to be injured, and it would be quite possible for divine providence to prevent Christ from being hit by the camel. Also, he might have such good... Aquinas thinks that Christ has, a body formed by the Holy Spirit, so he's pretty agile and everything. His senses work well. He probably, could have dodged the camel.
So surely he could have. But if the claim is that he doesn't assume the powers that could not, and it is impossible for them to be ordered towards the good of the incarnation, then it seems like the impassibility power is disqualified.
Yeah, you've got a great point.
Right.
So I have to think about it some more, but that's an excellent point.
This will probably be our last one.
Well, I just wanted to know if Christ could catch the flu from a camel. That's just a joke. Okay. No, thank you all for your very clear presentations. This has been this has been fantastic. I did want to ask Fritz one more question as I was thinking more about the presentation. So in the first question of the Summa, Thomas says the theologian knows what the philosopher knows, but under a different ratio. So it's analogous to the way that an astronomer and a mathematician might have similar knowledge about the same material object, but just under a different formal aspect.
Right.
And I was just wanting to know, to understand the burden of your paper, is the difference between Christ's infused and acquired knowledge substantially different from the distinction I'm drawing now to make the coexistence inscrutable?
Plausible. Yeah. I mean, you should really be asking Father Gaine this question because he's thought a lot about this. But I mean, it seems to me that that's exactly the kind of move he tries to make. And the trouble I have is, I mean, it would only be analogous to that distinction, right? Because we're talking about two different kinds of acquired knowledge. So there just seems that might solve the problem of the kind of differently derived species perfecting the same power. But I think the thing that really makes me stumble is just the sheer implausibility of the idea of Christ having sort of active knowledge of all things that are humanly knowable, and not in a kind of a non-discursive way as you would in the beatific vision, but discursive knowledge. So like literally Christ knew whether the Orioles are going to get the wild card to be in the postseason. He knew that. He won't tell me when I pray to him, but and that there's just something about the sheer implausibility of it, right? Whereas I can imagine how two different people could know the same material object under different rationes, how the same person could know the same material object in an infused and an acquired manner. It's hard for me to imagine what that's like. I mean, I don't. That's really kind of that's the part where it really makes me stumble, right? But that's a very modern question. That's not the question Aquinas is asking. He's asking about the perfection of Christ's powers, right? So why doesn't he ask this question? Is it just because he's living before Kant or Descartes or something? But it seems to me a very natural question to ask, right? Like when Christ presumably has infused knowledge of Aramaic, what's going on when he's then getting acquired knowledge of Aramaic by watching Mary and Joseph speaking Aramaic at home, right? How does his infused knowledge, perfect knowledge of physics, affect his learning how to walk at age 1? And it's these kinds of questions that is hard for me to imagine that Thomas didn't ask, and maybe he doesn't ask it for a particular purpose. Maybe there's a reason why he doesn't think these are questions worth asking. So I don't know. So.